20th century Scooby-Doo cartoons are an interesting example of how many different uses one can creatively have for horror. They're not as lighthearted as the Munsters, but don't take themselves as seriously as The Ring. They're a middle ground that gradually raise tension as high as they can before presenting action, with the kind of humor you'd find in a Friday the 13th movie sprinkled throughout. Now that I think about it, they have an oddly similar formula. In a way, it makes all the spooky setup done in the first half of a Scooby-Doo cartoon work against how they want the children to walk away feeling calm after the finale. Imagine how tricky it can be to make this not just turn into you ruining all the horror you set up. You simultaneously don't want children to complain about being too scared afterward while not making them think all the tension built up to something disappointing or was ruined by the jokes. So how did they approach this formula in video games? Well, let's go back to what might be the most infamous time in video game history, when shortly after video games surpassed Hollywood and pop music combined in the early 1980s. Players found themselves drowning under a pile of low-effort shovelware from people trying to make a quick buck off of how low the bar for entry on the most popular game platforms were. It's said during this time that programmer Mark Kennedy was working on a maze game called 3 Blonde Mice that may have been mistakenly corrected to 3 Blind Mice before Mattel got a license and said it's a Scooby-Doo game now. Scooby-Doo's maze chase for the Intellivision in 1983 has you chasing ghosts while a skull your size pursues you. What adds to the complexity is obtaining bones that can be laid down like traps as they stall the skull when it presumably bites down on them. There's 10 stages and a level editor to make mazes of your own. But what surprised me the most is how well a horror soundtrack was executed during gameplay. There's a low, droning tone that becomes rising horror strings to subconsciously pull your stress with them, similar to how Space Invader score's increasing pace is reminiscent of a raising heartbeat, ultimately being about your triumph during this. The game interestingly goes for you to have the same progression of feelings that a Scooby-Doo cartoon would try to get out of a viewer. And perhaps no creativity is more impressive to me than that born of the most limitation. But I might describe the scope of this game during its actual gameplay as that golden age arcade cabinet, which is below the level of complexity I prefer in even a second-generation home console game. The game that followed would have the opposite problem, going so ambitious that it seemed to bite off more than its programmers could chew. It would appear they wanted to make a full FMV game for home desktops like Dragon's Lair in arcades, but I'm not sure even Dragon's Lair pulled that feat off. The Scooby Games publisher Elite gave up, and instead rushed to release a far less ambitious game before their license expired. Simply titled Scooby-Doo, you explore a castle punching ghosts in the face on your fast-paced journey to rescue your captured friends. The pacing in this game is an odd choice to me, but I assume they were just too scared to do anything beyond the simplest of video games they could picture. For a game with constant combat, it doesn't feel very great, as there's seemingly no wind down to your short jab, leaving you just spamming it as you wait for endless enemies to walk into it. I like the designs and attempt to add diversity to the layout of the castle, but this all goes to waste in a game that ultimately doesn't hold my interest or use the IP well at all. Maze Chase was about as far as I can imagine pushing the courage of Scooby-Doo in a fight-or-flight scenario before putting him in an out-of-character Rambo rage for his friends. Perhaps this gameplay idea more fits Scrappy-Doo, and that's what we got next. A 1991 home desktop game where you play as Scooby's scrappy nephew taking on a castle of horror tropes to rescue Scooby and Shaggy. While not exactly head and shoulders above its contemporaries, I find this rendition of the last game's concept to be much more fully fledged with a variety of locations, obstacles, and a greater focus on platforming and collecting to break up the combat. The visual direction is also no slouch, but it is still as basic a concept as you could come up with for a video game at the time. And to me mostly squanders the potential of the IP it's licensing. What made me interested in the original 60s cartoon was the awe my child self had for the horror atmosphere. And I don't think you need Dragon's Lair quality animation to recreate that. You may not even need to abandon this gameplay style. 1995 Scooby-Doo Mystery for the SNES has the player go through multiple well-animated mysteries recreating the music and look of the original series. Despite being a side-scroller with real-time combat and platforming, it feels at home with episodes of the show, from the slower pacing to what voice acting there is. Though it is very uncanny how characters just stare directly at the player when idle. In fact, it'd be nice if they had more investigation-focused animation loops to be in when the player runs into them. This game does a decent job at gamifying the show. You have a traditional health bar and lies, with Daphne being the healer of the party, but it's contextualized by the bar representing your health starting empty and increasing as you take damage because it's actually a fear meter before you get scared to death, with Daphne giving you snacks to cool your nerves. You might imagine you can make an even closer adaptation with a point-and-click game, and that's what would be attempted on Sega's 4th gen console, though you might find its execution a little head-scratching. This time it's a single double feature that you'll quickly find this is to go for quality over quantity. The visuals, gameplay, variety, ideas for what you're actually doing are both incredibly executed and as accurate to the show as the SNES game. But unlike the SNES game, it doesn't strike me as trying to recreate the tone, atmosphere, and pacing of Scooby-Doo. In fact, it comes off as a generic point-and-click of the time. The characters and animation look like the show, but the environmental art is a little overly wacky like you'd commonly see in point-and-click games of the time. It uses music from the show, but the tone just strikes me as perhaps more focused on making a by-the-numbers point-and-click than really trying to recreate the show's mood. Every shot is so visually crowded and well lit with complex animations to show off, which is the opposite of the original show's visual design and mood setting. The soundtrack then matches this visually noisy presentation. Perhaps it feels more like Scooby and Shaggy crossing over with the typical world of point-and-click games at the time, which many must enjoy. But I can't help but feel that the SNES side-scrolling platform managed to better capture the slow-paced, dimly lit atmospheric horror of the original cartoons. And this does present itself as an adaptation of Where Are You!, not what came after. Now around this time there were popular point-and-clicks for very young audiences like the Putt-Putt series that focused on entrancing kids by presenting a highly interactable world of over-the-top animations. And it strikes me that this kind of game is what the Learning Company's 2000 game Showdown in Ghost Town wanted to be. This game gives you a spooky, activity-filled investigation for children featuring the Scooby-Doo cast, including what might be my favorite twist on the trope of the gang being chased through doors, gamifying it to you standing in front of the scene and trying to throw pies at the monster while not hitting your comrades. It's also a nice touch that of all the Old West songs they could have used, they implemented Clementine into the game's soundtrack, the staple of the even older Hanna-Barbera dog mascot Huckleberry Hound. But this game simultaneously feels like it's trying to be more accurate to the show's tone than the more remembered 1995 point-and-click, while also feeling like it's taking more liberties to have its own style that it thinks fits the show. The warm sunset color scheme throughout is not the dead of night most people probably see as the show's color scheme, but presents a visually appealing ghost town atmosphere that matches the Western vibes and tries to be its own unique atmosphere, which is something I'm also saying about the cartoons of the time. You want to do new and fresh while still keeping what made the IP appealing. Though I can't help but feel this format of point-and-click would have been more appropriate for a pup named Scooby-Doo than the standard Doo's more restrained pacing and grounded animation style. This style of game wants those more over-the-top animations that would feel out of place for the standard Doo. And this game repeats the fourth wall break of everyone's idol pose, having them stare directly at the player like a children's game where the player is treated like a character in the story directing everyone, compared to this game where it just comes off as an out-of-place trope since no one directly addresses the player. Also, while there are many shots in this game where there's a higher level of visual clarity than even the original show, it puts a magnifying glass on the animation quality. I remember someone who worked on the 1990s Superman cartoon say the initial art style put forward was more reminiscent of the 1940s cartoon. And he basically said, we don't have the budget to animate in that art style. That's a problem I felt was widespread in video games trying to do cartoon art styles in the 1990s. Whenever you see these 90s desktop games that are trying to be children's cartoons, it's especially evident. They reach the level of complexity to their characters that need the animation level of the show to look natural. But instead they still often had the animation quality of 16-bit sprites. I'd even say closer to 8-bit animation. I've always wondered how much easier it is to animate in polygons. It's a discipline I may never take the time to learn, but can't help but notice how many move to it, achieving smoother animation even without motion capture. It even often had the opposite problem where it could look uncanny because the animation quality was much higher than the model quality that often looked below cel animation when it came to texture, shading, and smooth lines. You can see it in the cutscenes of Scooby-Doo Mystery of the Fun Park Phantom, and they did nail that animation to a T. The pacing and setup is great, but they seem to greatly struggle with the texture and shading of the show's look. If you take a screenshot of the show and try to use the paint bucket tool, it won't fill in anything because nothing is a solid color. And instead of that texture happening natural, it now has to be manually recreated. This is a top-down turn-based game where you and 3 friends or bots can select one of the 4 human characters and essentially work together, or I guess even compete with each other to solve the mystery. You're all free to explore separately from each other, and while there is action points, you can also set a time limit to turns. Most call it a Scooby-Doo version of Clue, which is a board game I've only seen the movie adaptation of, but it sounds like an appropriate source of inspiration. For Nintendo's 5th generation console, Classic Creep Capers seems to attempt to be an evolution of the Super Nintendo game, but strikes me more as a cautionary tale of bad design. As its name implies, you play through a trilogy of classic Scooby-Doo cartoons with additions to tie them into an original 4th story. A good idea that appropriately starts with the debut cartoon What a Night for a Night, but acquaints you with its less than satisfying execution. While this cartoon did a great job of introducing everyone, its atmosphere, and was full of story beats that would make natural gameplay adaptations, Classic Creep Capers makes very poor use of its source material from a narrative, gameplay variety, and general presentation standpoint. It rewrites these stories to be straightforward and formulaic to the point that they're boring. Take for example my favorite scene in this cartoon where they initially try to break into the museum via Fred's shoulder tackling the door open before having the idea to have Shaggy, who's the best gymnast at their school, get in through a small upper window that nobody else could fit through. And when the ladder they brought can't reach, he uses the jack to raise it high enough for Shaggy's athletic skill to get the rest of the way, introducing them as two high school jocks of different skills who cover each other's blind spots to make a great team. In the game, Fred just goes look a window, and the player grabs the ladder, which reaches such a large window that it makes no sense why Shaggy and Scooby are going in to sneak around the guard and let the rest in. Why wouldn't they just climb the easily accessible ladder into the giant window? Maybe they rewrote these stories to have Scooby with you more often so you can do the recreation of the SNES minigame that serves as a full heal in each location's kitchen area, as Daphne is no longer a healer. In fact, there's healing snacks all over the floor. You're dealing with the fear meter again instead of health, but really it just serves as an unsatisfying animation for being hit. Unlike the SNES game where you can open your map to see where each member of your party is as they served a different purpose and would move around. In the N64 game, they usually stand in one place in a safe room and only Fred can be talked to be given the items you collect around to end each level by giving them all to Fred to spring a trap. The game not only diminishes their roles narratively, but makes the general world feel less alive. The graphics are top-notch, and probably the strongest part of this game, yet the poor directing undermines that to create poor presentation, and the original but too unrestrained music sure doesn't help. There's no combat in this game as it's been replaced with clock tower style chase horror, that overall lacks effort in presenting and selling its pursuers. It's very charming reading people online say they were scared of the Black Knight in this game as kids. I can easily see his clanking being a great idea for pursuer horror, like hearing the tyrant's footsteps in the other rooms in the 2019 RE2 remake. But this game's pursuers are too often confined to rooms like the tyrant in original RE2, rarely allowing them to chase you between rooms like a clock tower pursuer. And these are rather large areas that stop that from being too much of a challenge for even novice players. When it comes to movement, instead of being a point and click, you are manually walking up to things to press A. I've seen people complain there's no tank controls despite the frequently changing cameras, and these must be the type that never check the options menu where you can select between 2D and 3D controls like Silent Hill 2 and 3, in which the opposite complaint is made, where people complain the games have 3D controls without ever finding out you can select 2D controls. And I appreciate when using tank controls in this game, even on the D-pad, it actually switches to controlling from the camera's perspective during the Crash Bandicoot-style chase sequences. Though both 2D and 3D controls seem to have a similar problem where if you change which direction you're holding without completely letting go of the previous, you'll slide instead of change direction. And the NPC Scooby that spends most of the game with you can't be walked through, making his less than perfect pathfinding get in your way, creating a comical recipe for a game whose main meat is chase sequences. They should have just had him jump in your arms to at least cut down on this, but really he just shouldn't be with you so often and not be able to block you. On one hand, I could see it creating comical situations where you bump into him, but it doesn't really create satisfaction when there's no animation of you bumping into anything like the SNES game, which ultimately this game feels a step back from. There is a Game Boy Color game by the same name that went its own distinct route, being an adaptation of the Dr. Jekyll story, but that's the 21st century. And these two are the first I can think of being under THQ to have quite the run publishing Scooby-Doo games in the 21st century, having the overhead of the PS2's emotion engine and graphic synthesizer to aid in adapting the 1969 comedy horror. But perhaps that is a tale for another time. I'm Oktar.